Born into the dysfunctional Spanish Bourbon court in 1784, Prince Ferdinand was the heir to a throne largely controlled by his mother, Queen Maria Luisa of Parma, and her powerful lover, Prime Minister Manuel Godoy. From his youth, Ferdinand was excluded from government affairs, a situation that fostered resentment and a penchant for conspiracy. He became a rallying point for popular discontent against Godoy and his parents, culminating in the 1808 tumult of Aranjuez, which forced his father, Charles IV, to abdicate in his favor. Ferdinand's initial, brief reign was cut short by Napoleon Bonaparte, who lured the new king to Bayonne, France. In a humiliating episode, Napoleon forced Ferdinand to return the crown to his father, who then handed it to the French emperor. Napoleon installed his own brother, Joseph Bonaparte, as King of Spain, and held Ferdinand captive in France for the duration of the brutal Peninsular War. Ironically, it was during his 6-year exile that Ferdinand's myth was born. For the Spanish people rising up against the French invaders, their absent king became a powerful symbol of national identity and hope. They called him El Deseado, the Desired, and fought a bloody war in his name. In 1812, liberal reformers, fighting for Ferdinand, established the Progressive Constitution of Cadiz, which created a constitutional monarchy. However, the reality of the king would clash violently with the myth. When Napoleon released him in 1814, Ferdinand returned to a Spain that had been transformed by war and revolution. Greeted by adoring crowds and urged on by conservative nobles and the church, his first major act was to betray the very people who had fought for him. On May 4, 1814, he abolished the Constitution of 1812, declared its creators traitors, and restored absolute monarchy. This marked the beginning of a dark chapter for Spain. Ferdinand reinstated the Spanish Inquisition, suppressed Freemasons, and launched a ruthless persecution of liberals, many of whom were arrested, exiled, or executed. His reign became known for its political cruelty and incompetence, leading to the eventual loss of most of Spain's American colonies. This period of brutal repression was so severe it became known as the Ominous Decade. The moniker Felon King was not only due to his political tyranny, but also to his tumultuous and scandalous personal life. Allegations of extreme perversion and cruelty have shrouded his legacy. He was married 4 times, with his first 3 wives dying young, some under mysterious circumstances, leading to whispers of abuse and foul play. Court documents and historical accounts allege a pattern of disturbing behavior, including voyeurism, sadistic tendencies, and the use of his power to blackmail and coerce courtiers and their families. Secret court documents and diplomatic reports from the era describe a monarch obsessed with vice, who allegedly maintained an informal harem and used the Inquisition as a tool to satisfy his depraved desires. Rumors circulated about his masculinity and his desperate and sometimes bizarre attempts to produce an heir, which only succeeded late in his life with the birth of 2 daughters. The most humiliating legend suggests that he ordered the preservation of his genitals after his death, a testament to a lifelong obsession with his own virility and legacy. Ferdinand's final significant act was to alter the line of succession. Having no male heirs, he published the Pragmatic Sanction of 1830, allowing his infant daughter, Isabella, to inherit the throne, displacing his more conservative brother, Don Carlos. This decision plunged Spain into a series of bloody civil wars, the Carlist Wars that would haunt the nation for decades after his death in 1833. Ferdinand VII's legacy is one of profound failure and cruelty. He inherited the hopes of a nation and squandered them through tyranny and personal depravity, transforming himself from the Desired into the Felon King and leaving behind a broken, divided country. The Ominous Decade, a kingdom in fear. The period following Ferdinand's restoration of absolute power in 1823, after a brief, failed liberal uprising, is known in Spanish history as the Década Ominosa, or the ominous decade. This was not merely a return to old ways. It was a systematized and vengeful campaign to eradicate every trace of liberal thought from Spanish soil. Ferdinand, deeply paranoid and vindictive, unleashed a wave of terror that solidified his reputation as the Felon King. His primary instruments of this repression were the Voluntarios Realistas, Royalist volunteers, a paramilitary force of zealots more loyal to the king's person than to the state. They became a law unto themselves, roaming the country, persecuting anyone suspected of liberal sympathies. Public squares that had once hosted debates and political discourse were now stages for public shamings, hangings, and garrottings. Universities were purged of dangerous professors and curricula, with subjects like political economy and constitutional law banned. The press was utterly muzzled, and a suffocating censorship fell over the arts and sciences. Spain, which had briefly tasted enlightenment and reform, was dragged back into an era of intellectual darkness. Economically, the country withered. Ferdinand's government was not only repressive, but also spectacularly incompetent. He distrusted anyone with talent or modern ideas, preferring to surround himself with a sycophantic clique of ultra-conservatives, known as the Camarilla. This shadow cabinet, often meeting in palace backrooms, was a nest of intrigue and corruption. Their disastrous financial policies, coupled with the permanent loss of the revenue-generating American colonies, pushed the Spanish state to the brink of bankruptcy. Infrastructure crumbled, trade stagnated, and the general populace suffered immensely under a regime that offered them only fear and poverty. The King's Wives, a chronicle of tragedy and intrigue. Ferdinand's personal life was as turbulent and cruel as his political reign. His desperate, almost pathological, need for a male heir led him through 4 marriages, each a story of political maneuvering, personal tragedy, and dark rumor. His first wife, Maria Antonia of Naples and Sicily, was a spirited and intelligent woman who was horrified by the corruption of the Spanish court under Charles IV and Godoy. She despised the prime minister and openly encouraged her husband, the young Prince Ferdinand, to conspire against him. Her political meddling and sharp tongue earned her powerful enemies, including Ferdinand's own mother. When Maria Antonia died suddenly of tuberculosis in 1806, rumors immediately spread that she had been poisoned by Queen Maria Louisa and Godoy. While never proven, the suspicion cast a long shadow, illustrating the toxic atmosphere of the court. After his restoration to the throne, Ferdinand married his niece, Maria Isabel of Portugal, in 1816. By all accounts, she was a gentle and cultured soul, credited with being the driving force behind the creation of the Royal Museum of Paintings and Sculptures, which would later become the world-renowned Prado Museum. Her tenure as queen was tragically short. In 1818, pregnant with her second child, she died in childbirth. The events surrounding her death became the stuff of ghoulish legend. Believing she was merely in a coma and desperate to save the infant heir, her physicians allegedly performed a gruesome cesarean section on what was already a corpse. Both mother and child were lost, adding another layer of horror to Ferdinand's reign. His third marriage, in 1819, was to Maria Josepha Amelia of Saxony. This union was a notorious failure. The new queen was profoundly pious, raised in a convent, and reportedly horrified by the physical obligations of marriage. Ferdinand, crude and impatient, was allegedly disgusted by her religious scruples and aversion to him. For years, the marriage remained unconsummated, a subject of humiliation for the kin and gossip throughout the courts of Europe. It took a personal appeal from the Pope himself to convince Maria Josepha to finally submit to her marital duties. Despite this, she remained childless and died in 1829, leaving Ferdinand, now in his mid-40s, still without an heir, a final gamble. The Queen and the pragmatic sanction time was running out. Ferdinand's health was failing, and the question of succession was critical. His younger brother, the Infante Carlos, was the heir presumptive. Don Carlos was an arch-conservative, even more ultra-royalist than Ferdinand himself, and he was the hope of the faction that believed the king was still too lenient. Desperate, Ferdinand entered his fourth and final marriage with another niece, Maria Cristina of the Two Sicilies. She was vivacious, charming, and politically astute, everything his previous wives were not. She quickly understood the dynamics of the court and her husband's character. To the astonishment of everyone, she succeeded where others had failed, becoming pregnant soon after their marriage. In 1830, she gave birth to a healthy daughter, Isabella. The birth of a daughter presented a constitutional crisis. Spain's traditional succession law, the Siete Partidas, had allowed for female succession. However, in the early 18th century, the Bourbon dynasty had introduced Salic law, which barred women from the throne. Critically, King Charles IV had secretly approved a reversal of this law in 1789 but never formally published it. Under the influence of his new wife, Maria Cristina, and seeking to block his deeply disliked brother Carlos from power, Ferdinand made his final fateful move. In 1830, he formally issued the Pragmatic Sanction, ratifying his father's secret decree and ensuring that his daughter Isabella would be his rightful heir. This act tore the country in two. The supporters of Don Carlos, the ultra-royalists, the church, and conservative rural regions were outraged. They saw the sanction as a betrayal of tradition and a liberal plot orchestrated by the Queen. They became known as the Carlists. On the other side were the supporters of the infant Isabella, the Isabelinos or Cristinos, who, ironically, were comprised of the very liberals whom Ferdinand had spent his entire reign persecuting. They saw a regency under Maria Cristina and a future with Queen Isabella II as their only hope for a return to constitutional government. Ferdinand VII died on September 29, 1833. As he was laid to rest, the kingdom he had ruled with an iron fist exploded. Don Carlos declared himself King Carlos V, and the First Carlist War began. Ferdinand, the desired who became the Felon King, had managed, as his final act, to guarantee that his legacy would be one of bloodshed. He had not only terrorized his people in life, but had bequeathed them a century of brutal civil war, leaving a scar on the soul of Spain that would take generations to heal. A legacy written in blood, the Carlist Wars, the moment Ferdinand VII drew his last breath. The carefully constructed dam holding back the flood of civil war broke. His brother, Don Carlos, viewing the Pragmatic Sanction as an illegal and heretical act, declared himself King Carlos V. The northern regions of Spain, Navarre, the Basque Country, and parts of Catalonia and Aragon rose up in his name. These were areas with strong traditions of local autonomy, fueros, deep-seated religious conservatism, and a profound distrust of the centralizing liberals in Madrid. For them, the Carlist cause, wrapped in the slogan, God, Country and King, was a holy crusade to preserve their ancient way of life against the tide of modernity. On the other side stood the king is dead. Long live the war. The moment Ferdinand VII drew his last breath, the carefully constructed dam of his absolute power shattered, unleashing a torrent of violence that had been building the Isabelinos, loyal to the infant Queen Isabella II and her regent mother, Maria Cristina. In a twist of historical irony, for years, his death was not a moment of peace or transition, but a signal for war. In the Basque Country, Maria Cristina was forced to build her government on the very liberals her husband had spent a lifetime torturing and executing. She issued en Navarre, conservative strongholds in the north. Priests and local leaders raised the banner for Don Carlos, crying an amnesty, released political prisoners, and allied herself with the progressive forces that sought a constitutional monarchy and a centralized modern Spanish, Dios, Patri, Fueros, Rey, God, Country, regional laws, King. The Carlists assembled state. The First Carlist War, 1833 to 1840, was a conflict of unparalleled their armies. They were a movement of radical traditionalism, fighting for an idealized, pre-Enlightenment Spain, brutality. It was not a war of grand armies meeting in open fields, but a savage guerrilla war characterized by ambushes, raids. They wanted the absolute monarchy restored in the person of a king they considered legitimate, and they fought to protect their ancient regional privileges and merciless reprisals. Villages were burned, prisoners were routinely executed, and a deep, ideological hatred poisoned the Spanish soul. Fueros, and the supreme authority of the Catholic Church against the perceived threat of liberalism and centralization from Madrid. There, the war pitted city against countryside, modernizers against traditionalists, and in many cases, neighbor against neighbor. While forces were composed of devout peasants, rural gentry, and clergymen, masters of guerrilla warfare in the rugged northern mountains, the Isabelino forces, with the support of Britain and France, ultimately prevailed. The Carlist cause was not extinguished. Against them stood the Isabelinos or Cristinos, a fragile and deeply ironic coalition. Ledeldered for decades, erupting into 2 more major civil wars and numerous smaller uprisings, cementing a legacy of political instability, and by the Queen Regent, Maria Cristina, this faction was forced to embrace the very liberals Ferdinand had spent 2 decades trying to exterminate violence that would directly contribute to the cataclysm of the Spanish Civil War a century later. Ferdinand, in his selfish hate to secure her daughter Isabella's throne, Maria Cristina had no choice but to grant amnesties, recall quest to choose his heir, had not secured his daughter's throne, but had guaranteed that it would rest upon a foundation of skulls exiles, and promise a more moderate, constitutional form of government. Her army was the official state military, but its loyal, inside the mind of the Felon King, depravity, paranoia, and power toadies were often divided. The war became a brutal clash of ideologies, the rural, traditionalist, religious past versus the urban. Understand Ferdinand's political cruelty, one must look at the man himself. Far from the dignified, enlightened monarch his people had, liberal, modernizing future. The First Carlist War raged for 7 years. 1833 once imagined, Ferdinand was coarse, vulgar, and profoundly cynical. Diplomatic dispatches from the era describe a king with BO 1840, and was fought with sickening cruelty on both sides. Prisoners were often executed without trial, anderish manners, a fondness for crude jokes, and a complete lack of intellectual curiosity. He was not a grand strategist or a political. Entire villages were punished for supporting the enemy. It was a civil war that bled the nation, institutionalized political violence, and deepened philosopher. He was a street-smart conspirator who saw everyone as a potential rival. His primary governing tool was the fractures in Spanish society. Though the Isabelinos ultimately triumphed, the Carlist cause was not extinguished. It would amar al. His informal clique of confidants. This was not a council of wise advisors, but a collection of sycopholder for generations, erupting in 2 more major wars and becoming a permanent, destabilizing force in Spanish politics. Ants, flatterers, and spies. Their primary currency was gossip and intrigue. Ferdinand delighted in hearing scandalous rumors about his cour, the private king, a portrait of depravity. While the political consequences of his reign were catastrophic, it wasted years and ministers, which he would then use for blackmail and manipulation. He reveled in setting his underlings against one the persistent and lurid tales of his personal life that cemented his most infamous legacy. Separating verified fact from court gossip and political slander is difficult, but the sheer volume of accounts paints a damning portrait of a monarch consumed by his own obsessions and another, ensuring that no one but him could ever accumulate too much power. This system bred endemic corruption and paralyzed the government, insecurities. Central to his character was a profound and volatile mix of sexual anxiety and sadistic impulse. Historical sources, including the reports as competence and honesty were liabilities, while loyalty and a willingness to engage in deceit were rewarded. Stories of his personal debt of foreign ambassadors describe him as crude, vulgar, and possessing a cruel sense of humor. He surrounded himself with a depravity, are a mixture of documented fact and lurid rumor, yet they paint a consistent picture. He was a known voyaged inner circle, the Camarilla, who were chosen not for their competence, but for their ability to flatter his with some accounts claiming he had peepholes installed to spy on the private lives of court members. His pursuit ego and cater to his base desires. One of the most enduring legends about Ferdinand concerns his physical anatomy. He was rumored of women was not one of romance but of conquest and humiliation. The court was rife with tales of him, using his absolute to have been afflicted with macrosomia, or an unusually large endowment, which, far from being a source of pride, was said to have made intimacy difficult and painful for his partners. This physical peculiarity was whispered to be a cause of the marital problem's power to coerce the wives and daughters of nobles who had fallen out of his favor. This dark side was perhaps best captured with his pious third wife, Maria Josepha, and a source of deep personal frustration in his quest for an heir. Beyond physical anomalies, his behavior was allegedly marked by deep-seated perversions. Court insiders chronicled a king who engaged in rampant voyeurism, spying on courtiers, and demanding graphic reports of their private lives. He was said to take a sadistic pleasure in the humiliation of others, orchestrating elaborate and cruel practical jokes, and using his absolute power to ruin the lives of those who displeased him, often for the most trivial reasons. His restoration of the Spanish Inquisition was not merely a political tool. It was an extension of his own paranoid and intrusive nature. Under his rule, the Holy Office became an instrument for enforcing social and sexual conformity, prying into the bedrooms and private affairs of his subjects, mirroring the king's own obsessive and controlling personality. The public image of a pious defender of the faith stood in stark contrast to the private reality of a debauched and cruel sovereign, a hypocrisy that was not lost on the Spanish people or foreign observers. The Final Judgment, the Court Painter. Francisco Goya. In his youth, Goya had painted a stunning group portrait of the royal family of Charles IV, subtly exposing its dysfunction. He served Ferdinand upon his restoration, but Goya's later works, the famous black paintings, created in the final years of his life, are seen by many art historians as a descent into the psychological abyss of Ferdinand's Spain. These terrifying, grotesque images of witches, demons, and Saturn devouring his son, painted on the walls of his own home, are a powerful metaphor for a nation consuming itself under a tyrannical and malevolent king. The final verdict of history. Ferdinand VII's reign stands as a monumental tragedy in Spanish history. He was a man uniquely positioned to heal a nation ravaged by war and guide it into a new era. Armed with the unprecedented love and goodwill of his people, he could have become a celebrated constitutional monarch, a Spanish equivalent of Britain's William IV. Instead, fueled by paranoia, vindictiveness, and a deep-seated personal insecurity, he chose the path of the tyrant. He betrayed the Constitution he had sworn to uphold, persecuted the heroes who had fought in his name, and plunged his kingdom into an era of intellectual darkness and economic ruin. He was a king who trusted no one and was trusted, a legacy of ruin. When Ferdinand VII's reign is weighed in the scales of history, it is found by no one, who was loved upon his return and despised by the time of his death, his final act to be an unmitigated disaster for Spain. He inherited a global empire and left behind a fractured nation on the brink of disintegration. The succession was not one of enlightened foresight, but of personal spite against his brother. It was the ultimate embodiment of his character. He was given the adoring title, the Desired, and earned the damning moniker, the Felon King. His a decision made for purely selfish reasons that unleashed catastrophic consequences upon the millions he ruled. He began his story as legacy is one of profound and lasting damage, political instability, by violently suppressing liberalism only to have El Decido asterisk, the symbol of hope. He ended it as El Rey Felon, the Felon King. His heir depend on it for survival. He created a political paradox that guaranteed conflict. The 19th century in Spain whose name would forever be synonymous with betrayal, repression, and the ignition of a century of Spanish civil strife. He did be defined by the struggle between these two forces, leading to a succession of weak governments, military coups, pronunciamientos, and civil wars, economic stagnation. His corrupt and incompetent administration squandered the nation's wealth, not just rule Spain. He broke it.